Now we will proceed to the third and longest part of the dialogue. As for its significance for the world of today, I will admit these are my opinions, and you may disagree. We will examine what may be the best argument put forward for the idea that might makes right, and that if you end up on the losing end, your moralizing about it being unjust is not just the whining of a sore loser, but also incorrect. Today's way of saying might makes right is that it's the calendar year, it is what it is, and we should be on the right side of history. And Socrates will be advised to do this by ceasing to talk in ways that may upset people with power and influence. Yet, historically, Plato won against the sophists, with the sophists failing to dominate the world of ideas for over 2,000 years, albeit with the help of similar ideas of Christianity, which also has a hero unjustly put to death. The third part starts with Callicles asking whether Socrates is talking in jest or seriously. The opinions that Socrates expressed to Polus were that it is worse to do an injustice than to suffer it, that it is better to be punished for having done an injustice, and that the tyrant is the most miserable man. Callicles was not convinced by what he heard, and his question is to ask if Socrates is serious, because if he is serious, and if he's right, our entire human world is upside down, and all we are doing is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Callicles, like Polus before him, seems to believe that Socrates is actually thinking as he, Callicles, does, and for some reason continues to put forth a different opinion to them. For clarification, Socrates states that they have feelings in common, as men often do, and that this is what makes communication possible. However, two individuals do not have all the same experiences and feelings. This is why someone else who seems very similar may not agree on something when we might anticipate that he would. In this case, both are acting out of love, but love for a different object. Socrates loves philosophy, while Callicles loves the Athenian demos. Socrates tells Callicles that with whatever opinions he asserts, he serves his favorite, the demos, or the common people whom Callicles is unable to contradict, no matter how much it shifts back and forth. In doing so, he is not being true to himself, creating discord within himself. Socrates, by contrast, loves philosophy, which is about the eternal and unchanging. Philosophy always speaks the same, while the multitude shifts its opinions. Socrates says it would be better for him if his lyre, or a chorus that he directs, should be out of tune and loud with discord, with the multitude of men disagreeing, than to have his single self out of harmony with itself. So what Socrates here does is to start off with Callicles, is to go back to what he said before about rhetoric being a form of flattery, and accuse Callicles of pandering to the masses, and then having to constantly shift opinions. Rather than being true to himself, Callicles changes into what the crowd makes him. Callicles responds that Socrates is himself speaking in a fit of eloquence like a true politician. He says that what he is doing relates to his victory over Polus. Polus has fallen victim to Socrates in the same way that Gorgias had done before, namely by conceding something to Socrates that he should not have conceded because he was ashamed to assert what he really thought. This begins one of the many speeches in the rest of the dialogue that will make the book a little less like a play and more like prose writing. Earlier, Gorgias was ashamed when asked about the prospect of a young man coming to him to learn rhetoric, without prior knowledge of justice. Gorgias bowed to convention when saying that he would teach him justice in that case, and it allowed Socrates to ensnare him in a contradiction. Then Polus conceded that it was uglier to do an injustice than to suffer it, and was effectively tangled up and gagged in the argument because he also was ashamed to come out and say what he really thought. According to Callicles, Socrates is using a clever trick he has devised to cheat in his arguments. Callicles draws a distinction between what is true by nature and what is believed by man-made conventions or social norms and values. By convention, Gorgias should teach a new pupil about justice if he comes to him ignorant of it. It is also conventionally believed that it is uglier to do an injustice than to suffer it. Socrates obtains these concessions that are believed by convention, and then speaks as if he had uncovered the true and beautiful according to a principle of nature. But nature is often, and in these cases at odds with conventions that form the social norms of common people. Now that he has established this nature-convention dichotomy, Callicles proceeds to construct an argument that it is right and just that the stronger rule over the weaker, and that the stronger may despoil the weaker of his property to obtain more than the weaker man thinks is his fair share. He argues that it is only true by convention that doing an injustice is uglier than suffering it. To suffer a wrong is not part of a man, but of a slave who is better off dead. This suffering is also for any man who is incapable of helping himself or a loved one, who is unjustly accused in the courts or otherwise wronged. It is a majority, consisting of weak people who create laws and conventions for their own advantage. The reason why convention declares it to be unjust to get the better of one's neighbor is because that majority, being themselves inferior, would be more content with equality. Callicles states that it is clear through many examples, not only in other animals but also in human states and communities, that nature reveals it to be just and proper that the better man should lord it over his inferior, that the stronger rule the weaker. That the stronger should rule over the weaker is how justice is determined. This is the principle of justice by which Xerxes invaded Greece, in accordance with the law of natural justice. It is likewise with the story from Pindar, where Heracles did not purchase the cattle or receive it as a gift from Geryon. It was as though it was a law of nature that the stronger should possess the herds and all the rest of the property of the inferior. At this point, the theory being put forth by Callicles invites comparison with a couple of 19th century ideas, but it is not an exact match with either one. I will deal with this issue quickly and get it out of the way. This theory has much in common with social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, although we do not here have a justification that it would produce more fit members of the species in future generations. What Callicles says about weak people who are more content with equality, making laws and conventions to suit that preference, is a portion of Nietzsche's view of the genesis of what he calls slave morality. In Nietzsche, we also see that, in his language, it is a feeling of ressentiment or resentment in the powerless people, leading to the idea that the actions of the stronger are evil, where this evil is a new term missing in the master morality that calls things good or bad. The probably biggest difference with Nietzsche is that for him, master morality is created by the stronger simply coining values of what is good or bad for him, and not thinking that nature dictates his dominion as a principle of justice. The master moralist does not seek to justify his actions to the mob. Since Nietzsche claims his theory to be historically accurate of how the ancients thought, this is a good place for me to point out that there is some question of whether Callicles actually existed at all, or whether he is actually a fictional character of Plato for the purpose of refuting a potential objection, or a theory that Plato thought sophists really believed but would never say aloud. Going back to the speech of Callicles, he now focuses on the original contention of Socrates that the life of philosophy is superior to that of rhetoric. Callicles says that he does consider philosophy a part of a good education for the young, but a negative thing at a mature age. He will now foreshadow the fate of Socrates in what is actually being written by Plato after his death. Philosophy weakens a man's ability to defend himself and his loved ones before the courts or before public opinion. What he tells Socrates is that if anyone were to arrest you or any of your kind and drag you off to prison, declaring that you'd broken the law, though you hadn't done a thing, you know perfectly well that you wouldn't be able to help yourself. You'd stand there reeling and gaping and not having a thing to say. If the fellow brings you into court, though his accusations are never so unproven and false, you'd die the death if he chooses the death penalty. How can this be wisdom, Socrates? His advice is to take up the fine art of business and cultivate a reputation for good sense. It is interesting to note here the hypocrisy in Callicles' statements. To the extent that he is formulating a criterion of what constitutes the just and the good, he is himself doing the work of the philosopher. Now, to the modern mind, we might argue by saying that 2 wrongs or 2,000 wrongs do not make a right, and that what happens is not proof of what ought to happen. Socrates will approach it under what implications the theory of Callicles would have if it were true, and formulate an alternative theory that there is a way that nature harmonizes with the just and the good, but is not the way that Callicles imagines it to be. Socrates starts by getting clarification from Callicles that for him the man who is stronger is also better and superior. Callicles confirms that they are all the same. This is especially important for Plato because he also has his own aristocratic theory that the better man should rule. In Plato's case, as stated in the Republic, it is the philosopher who should rule the state by having philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers. That way, wisdom and governance are united in the same ruling person. However, the philosopher is not necessarily the man who has the ability to seize control of the state and impose his will upon all others. So for Plato, the stronger and the better are not the same, and his criterion would choose a different ruler. Once Callicles has admitted that he considers the stronger and the better man to be the same, Socrates argues that in reality the many are stronger than the one. Therefore, under the theory of Callicles, the majority of the people are therefore better, and their ordinances are therefore beautiful by nature because they are dictated by the stronger. It's difficult to argue with Socrates about this. You may be a strong man, but you have to sleep sometime, and even a child could have your throat sliced open before you even know what is happening. However rare it may be, there is always a possibility that the people may act collectively in overthrowing their king. Socrates continues that it is the belief of the multitude that justice consists in sharing equally, and that it is uglier to do an injustice than to suffer it. So far, Callicles agrees to all of this, but he will not concede to the conclusion Socrates derives from it, namely, that it is not only true by convention, but also true by nature, that to do wrong is uglier, and that justice is sharing equally if the stronger should rule the weaker. Instead, he responds by accusing Socrates of playing with words. When he said the stronger should rule, Socrates knew he meant that the better should rule, and rule over those who have no strength about them other than in their bodies. Callicles never meant to say that the strong slave and never-do-well should rule. Callicles, however, did actually say that the stronger and better are the same. Socrates responds that if Callicles does not think that the many are better than the one, and that slaves are not better because their combined strength is stronger, then he needs more clarification on what Callicles means by better. Does Callicles mean that the stronger and better are more intelligent, or whatever else they may be? In such case, are intelligent men many times stronger than 10,000 fools and should rule over them? Callicles responds that yes, that is what he means, that he who is better and more intelligent should rule and have the advantage over baser men. Socrates now continues by pursuing some meaning as to what would happen in practice. Imagine a great number of us are gathered on the same spot, with ample stock of provisions to eat and drink. A physician may be stronger to care for the provisions, since he is more intelligent in such matters. Callicles agrees. So the question now is about distribution. Should he have more than some and less than others? Should the skilled weaver likewise have the biggest coat and the finest garments? Should the cobbler have the largest number of shoes? Callicles appears to be getting angry about the questioning, and finally says he is talking only about those who are courageous and intelligent in politics, not shoemakers and doctors. Justice consists in the ruler having more than the ruled. So now Socrates is forced to go directly to the question about the rulers. Just what does Callicles mean by all his talk about ruler and ruled? Every man is his own ruler, and so should he get more than himself? More specifically, what Socrates means by a man being his own ruler is that when applied to the ruler of the state, the concepts of temperance and self-control, mastery over one's own pleasures and desires, is applicable for issues of justice. Callicles will disagree. In his thinking, it is unfit for a man to be a slave to anyone, including himself. What will follow will be a debate about an unrestrained version of hedonism, the doctrine that pleasure is the good. Various versions of this idea recur in philosophy after Plato and into the modern period. Callicles explains his theory of virtue and the good life in response. In order to live a full life, a man must allow his desires to become as mighty as they can be, and never repress them. When his passions are matured, he uses all his courage and intelligence to gratify all those desires. This is impossible for the mob, who are ashamed and who, he says, sing the praises of temperance and justice out of the depths of their own cowardice. They seek to drag down their master and subdue him. In truth, virtue occurs when license, luxury, and liberty have the upper hand, while all talk of temperance is a man-made convention that goes against nature. This is in some ways the world that we live in today. It is the conspicuous consumption of the rich, and the lifestyle advertising encouraging us to dream of a life where every desire is satisfied, while associating it with a corporate brand name. It is also the keep up with the Joneses mentality. Another application of this is divorces, where abuse does not occur and people having children out of wedlock or with multiple partners, often making the state a third parent that subsidizes single parents. Socrates now asks if Callicles would agree that those who want nothing are happy, and he responds that such is the life of a stone or a corpse. He asks about the metaphor of desire being like a leaky vessel that will never be filled. Will that convince Callicles that the ordered life is better than the unrestrained life? No, Callicles says it is the opposite. Socrates proposes another metaphor of two men with vessels of wine, honey, milk, and other goods, with one man having good jars, while the other has jars that always leak. Callicles does not accept this because once a man is full, he no longer retains the taste for the pleasure. Like with hunger and thirst, once a man is sated, he no longer feels pleasure or pain. Now Socrates has something that he can use. Now he will ask the important question of whether the pleasant and the good are the same, and Callicles will respond that he believes they are the same. Now we consider the issue of whether there are valid arguments that the pleasant is not the good. The first argument starts by saying that knowledge and courage are both different from each other and both different from the good. All three are distinct from each other. Good and evil fortunes, by contrast, are opposite conditions and mutually exclusive. Since they are mutually opposed, the relationship between them must be the same as that between sickness and health. Nobody is sick and well at the same time. A man gains or loses sickness or health alternatively, and the same is true of strength and weakness, speed and slowness. So it is with good and evil things, happiness and wretchedness. Since good and bad are mutually exclusive, with one gained and the other lost simultaneously, if we find something that a man may lose and possess simultaneously, it cannot be either good or bad. Callicles agrees. So going back to previous admissions, it is painful to be hungry and pleasant to eat in response. It is admitted that every sort of want or desire is painful in some way. Eating and drinking are only pleasant when one is hungry or thirsty. The consequence is that pleasure and pain are felt simultaneously, in the same time and place, whether in the soul or in the body. It is not possible to feel well and ill at the same time, but it is possible to feel pleasure and pain at the same time. The pleasure and pain from hunger and thirst cease together, but good and bad do not, because they are mutually exclusive. How then can pleasure be the same thing as good, and pain be the same thing as bad? So here is the first argument completed. Pleasure and pain cease simultaneously with the satisfying of desire, but good and bad are gained or lost at each other's expense. Therefore, pleasure is not the good. For a second argument, men who are brave and wise are good, but the foolish man can also feel pleasure pretty much to the same degree. The coward in wartime also experiences pleasure when the enemy retreats. Cowards potentially feel pleasure more, according to Callicles. Yet brave and wise men are good, while cowards and fools are bad, all while feeling pleasure or pain. Good men are good because of a presence of good within them, while bad men are bad in the same way. If we say, as Callicles will, that it is also true that when one feels pleasure, it is because of the presence of good, and the same with the feeling pain because of the presence of evil, we end up with a contradiction. The bad man ends up equally good or even better. So here we have the second argument. Bad men can feel pleasure through their wickedness, and thus pleasure is not the good. Callicles has agreed to all of it up to the end, but now criticizes Socrates for not recognizing that everyone agrees that some pleasures are better than others. This statement from Callicles puts him into another trap that creates a third argument. Obviously, if there can be good and bad pleasures, then there must be a higher standard by which we judge what are the good pleasures, making something other than pleasure the standard of the good. Socrates will go straight into that other standard that will bring out more arguments that philosophy is superior to rhetoric. The issue of good or bad pleasures and pains has already been brought up. Socrates reminds Callicles of pleasures of eating and drinking, and useful pains in medical procedures. It was also agreed with Polus that the goal of our actions is the good with action done for the sake of it. The good is not performed for the sake of pleasure. Instead, the pleasure is performed for the sake of the good. In that case, in order to decide what pleasures are good or bad, we require professional knowledge, and Callicles agrees. Socrates now goes back to earlier remarks to Polus about cookery, or quack medicine, snake oil, being a knack and not the true art that is medicine. He says that Callicles should stop taking this as a joke and understand that this leads to the question of how we should live our lives. He says they have both agreed that the good thing and the pleasant thing can be different. There are practical ways of obtaining each. So this raises the question of whether we should seek the good or seek pleasure. Now, a true medical art will make an inquiry into the nature of what it treats and the reason for the treatment. It is capable of giving an account of both. Cookery, by contrast, directs an unprofessional effort at pleasure without examining the nature of pleasure or its causes. It develops only by preserving memory of the results. Socrates now moves from the body to the soul with the question of whether there is an art suited to seeking the soul's best interest and whether there is a knack that is concerned only with the soul's pleasure. At this point, Socrates asks if Callicles agrees, and the response is that Callicles will just say he agrees in order to have Socrates finish for the benefit of Gorgias. Most of the rest of the dialogue in reality will be a speech by Socrates that can be described as if it were written in prose. Socrates continues that it is also possible to gratify a large crowd without considering what is best. Some activities, such as playing a flute or a harp, seek pleasure in no other object. Poets, however, can engage in a kind of public address, but is also a form of flattery. But what about orators? Do they always have an aim at the improvement of their fellow citizens? Or do they just pursue their own interests in gratifying their fellows? It seems that there are some who just gratify, while some others seek to improve their fellows, but Callicles cannot name a single orator who sought what is best. Among former statesmen, Callicles believes that Themistocles, Cimon, Miltiades, and Pericles had left the Athenians better people than they were before, but Socrates states that this position can only be true under the false presumption that pleasure is the good. If men should only fulfill the desires that make them better men, we would have to say something different about those former leaders. A good man whose speech is aimed at maximum improvement does not just say anything at random. He has a definite end in view, like any other craftsman. A painter or a shipwright disposes every element in a fixed order and adjusts the parts until he has a well-ordered object. Likewise, physicians and trainers direct their efforts to improving and harmonizing the body. A house or a sailing vessel is a good one only if it has an order and harmony. A well-ordered body is called healthy, and a well-ordered soul is called lawful, because it is law-abiding and orderly. The qualities that make for a well-ordered soul are justice and self-control. So here we have the hint that we have a need for philosophy, due to rhetoric not being sufficient to help create the well-ordered soul. The moral artist who studies justice and the good, and is therefore the real orator, applies his speech to engender justice and self-control in his fellows. Now one does not offer to a sick and wretched body all the food and wine that might sometimes do less good than their opposites. There is no advantage for a man with a wretched body to live at all. He who is healthy we let fulfill all his desires. Likewise, when a soul is wretched, we must keep it from all desires and action except those that will improve it. To keep the wretched soul from its desires is to punish it. Therefore, punishment is better for the soul than lack of control. Socrates now goes through a summary of what has been discussed and leads to the idea of a thing of excellence only being acquired through correct arrangement and order, including an excellent soul. That soul that has order will be better than the one that does not have it. An ordered soul has self-control, and therefore the self-controlled soul is good. As a consequence, the self-controlled man will do what is right, and in his conduct with other men will do what is just. Since he will not avoid what ought not to be avoided, he will also be courageous. Socrates now sums up his position on the good life. If a man wants to be happy, he should pursue and practice self-control. He must, as much as possible, stand in no need of punishment, but submit to it when needed. Justice and self-control is the good life, rather than allowing desires to run riot. He introduces here an idea of its harmony with nature. He who strives to fulfill endless desires will be incapable of sharing and therefore of friendship and order. He says that heaven and earth, gods and men, are held together by the principles of sharing, by friendship and order, by self-control and justice. That, my friend, is the reason they call the universe cosmos and not desire or licentiousness. As it happens, the Greek word for order is cosmos, and so he is saying that the universe is called order rather than disorder and licentiousness. Socrates further goes on to say that it is because Callicles neglects geometry and the power of geometric equality that he thinks he should strive for a larger share. Geometric equality refers to an idea of a form of justice consisting in proportional distribution. It is an opinion about distributive justice rather than retributive justice, with the retributive part consisting in punishment for crimes. For instance, for income distribution under this idea, it is just for a physician to have a higher income than a hotel manager, but not by a greatly large proportion. Today we have some corporate CEOs and professional athletes with incomes so much higher than the physician that it is out of proportion and is unjust if the difference between the physician and the hotel manager is just. The geometric part comes when we draw two lines representing the differences and see that the lines are different in a way that makes no sense. Callicles wants the tyrant to be allowed to take whatever he wants, and so it is geometrically unjust. Given all this, it will of course be true that the true art or techne of philosophy will be superior to the flatteries or knacks of sophistry and rhetoric. Now that Socrates has dealt with the identification of the good life, he will deal with the retort that he cannot prevent an injustice being done to him in the courts. His position still remains that it is better that there be no injustice at all anywhere. But is there a way to have insurance against suffering wrong? Before I go into that, I want to say that we today have that insurance, that we should stop trying to undermine and turn into its opposite if we want our civilization to continue. I am referring to constitutional provisions for freedom of speech. I assume that my audience here is composed of people who do not approve of the execution of Socrates and would like to not repeat it against others. But we must believe in freedom of thought and speech and support it in a genuine way, in its meaning that was intended prior to Orwellian double-speak rewrites. This means recognizing that it is the freedom to speak against power. Every country in the world at all times allows people to praise its glorious leader. And that's not why Voltaire was imprisoned in the Bastille. Consequences mean man-made penalties that are not to be imposed. To say you are in freedom of speech, but with consequences, is to speak in favor of repeating history. Now, it may seem reasonable to disallow people from trying to incite violence or threatening or insulting others, and many countries already have laws that forbid these and other verbal crimes like slander and blackmail. But we need it done in a way that still disallows people from being able to silence others by saying they are offended, especially when they should not be, or by a claim that it is somehow evil to believe any proposition that contradicts them. If I get to have you silenced and punished for disagreement with my political or religious opinions, then effectively I become the deep state that is the real ruler. Let's remember that Galileo and Copernicus deeply offended the religious sentiments of the crowd with their ideas of a sun with spots that the earth orbits. So in summary, the highest law of the land being freedom to speak against and offend political or religious dogma without so-called consequences. This was not in place for Socrates. Instead, it was the freedom to praise those in power or suffer consequences that condemned him, consistent with the theory of Callicles that justice is what is in the interests of he who wields power to silence others. Callicles says that the only way to insure oneself against injustice is by acquiring power. In his view, the art that renders one immune from injustice is the one that makes one the ruler of one's own country or a friend of the government. Socrates starts the argument about that with the idea that the strongest bond of friendship is like to like. Any man who is far better than the tyrant will be feared by him and cannot be a friend. If a man is worse, the tyrant will despise him. The tyrant's friend must be a person who praises and blames the same things, while being willing to be ruled. So to insure oneself the power to be immune from injustice, a man must make himself into a duplication of the tyrant. Then no man shall do him wrong. In doing so, he loses an immunity from doing wrong himself. The greatest of all evils befalls him. His soul becomes vicious and deformed by the imitation of his master. Callicles interrupts, saying that in such a case it is the imitator of a tyrant that can kill a man. Socrates says that it would be a ruffian killing a good man, and that it should not arouse indignation in the sensible man if his argument is correct. What is happening here is that Callicles is actually contradicting himself. He now implores Socrates with the idea that he should be horrified by the prospect of a ruffian being able to kill him through the courts. Socrates should feel aggravated by this and seek the power he needs to prevent it. But his earlier concept of justice says that the weakness of Socrates makes it just for the supposedly noble ruffian to kill him. For Socrates, The man who understands his argument fully does not make it a priority to have that insurance if there is something bad about it. The object of our lives is not to live as long as possible and lavish our effort cultivating arts to save us from danger. Of course, Socrates is famous for saying that the unexamined life is not worth living, and he does not want to live a long life with a damaged soul. He is about the quality of life. Callicles still insists he is giving Socrates good advice, and Socrates asks if he has a high regard for the art of swimming, which he does not. So what does swimming have to do with all this? Well, swimmers have a skill that saves men from death. Also, navigators ensure that their passengers make it alive to their destination. Yet the men who perform these acts do not put on airs or strike attitudes as if they performed some terrific feat. They know that anyone who has escaped drowning but has a wretched body or soul has received no benefit from them. Sometimes an engineer is able to preserve a whole city, which is not something any legal pleader can do. If saving lives is the only thing that is important, the engineer could make the argument that Callicles should abandon the life of rhetoric and become an engineer. Yet Callicles holds these people in contempt and pretends he is the better man. That contempt is absurd if virtue consists in only saving oneself and one's property, irrespective of one's character. But if the noble and good is something different from merely saving lives, men should surrender to God and destiny such considerations, given that we cannot live forever anyway. The question now becomes, according to Socrates, whether Callicles should make himself as similar as possible to the Athenian people in order to acquire power in the state. He cannot be unlike the people in temper, and also sufficiently gain power and influence. He will become an imitation of the people and conform to the mob, because everyone is pleased by the speeches that are already in accord with their point of view. Here we have something suggesting that Callicles is actually a victim of what he says he tries to prevent. He says he wants to insure his life against an unjust political attack, but at the expense of not being himself. His body continues to live, but in some sense the true Callicles has committed suicide. It harkens back to an earlier statement from Socrates that Callicles is not true to himself and in conflict with himself. The insurance against injustice that Callicles recommends to Socrates is effectively purchased at a cost of an injustice to oneself. By contrast, the legend of Socrates is that he was true to himself right to his death. Callicles resists this thinking because the love of the demos lies within him, so he will conform and be a puppet of the people. This, I think, is Socrates' better argument for not insuring himself against injustice by seeking power. He will end the discussion with a claim that he who does an injustice will get what is coming to him in the afterlife, although I myself don't see why that should be the case if we are only capable of doing injustice when we don't know what justice is. Socrates now goes back to what he said earlier about rhetoric being a form of flattery. Whether in body or in soul, there are two ways of cultivating something: to aim at maximizing pleasure and to aim at the best good. The goal of pleasure seeks to soothe and placate people, while the aim of good actually combats them. According to Socrates, the method of pleasure will not only pander to the mob, but also bring out the worst within them. It will refuse to ruffle the self-esteem of the lowest common denominator. It is like the teacher who teaches to the weakest student in the class, leaving the others behind the point they would otherwise be at the end. It is the school system that refuses to tell a child that he failed. It is the sports league for children that gives everyone a trophy and won't keep score. It is also a church that no longer tells people that the health of the soul needs work. If Plato is right, we need more voices telling people exactly what they don't want to hear, but will be good for them. Now Socrates will consider the track records of Callicles and one of his favorite rulers. Did they make people better citizens than what they were before? If we are to engage in public affairs and endeavor to urge others into architectural feats in the construction of buildings, walls, and docks, we need to first examine ourselves to see if we understand it. Who is our teacher of this? We should select the sound teacher who has numerous works to his credit. It is also true with the other professions. If we look for a state physician, we should look at the records of the applicants. This goes back to refuting Gorgias and his statement that he could get himself appointed state physician over the true physician because one need only study rhetoric. Socrates says a good statesman will choose the real physician due to his track record. And since Callicles is trying to encourage Socrates into public affairs, what is his track record? Can Callicles name a single person that he has made a better citizen? Of course, regarding that question about Socrates himself, it is Plato who is the author of this dialogue that effectively vouches for him. Callicles responds that Socrates is trying to pick a quarrel, but Socrates insists instead that he really just wants to know how politics should be conducted. According to Socrates, it is the chief obligation of the politicians to improve their citizens. It is what he considers to be the true art of politics, as opposed to the forms of flattery that are sophistry and rhetoric. Callicles still believes that the former statesmen he named earlier had in fact made the Athenians better citizens than what they were at the start of their rule. They will discuss Pericles, and it is agreed that if Pericles was a good man, the Athenians would have become better under his influence. The reputation Socrates has of Pericles is that he corrupted the Athenians, whom he made idle, cowardly, loquacious, and greedy through his system of public fees. But Callicles regards that as the statement of unpatriotic people. However, it is not by hearsay alone that Pericles was found guilty of embezzlement and sentenced to death under the impression that he was a scoundrel. Although Callicles might question it, yes, it does make him a bad man. If he were a keeper of horses who start off tame when he acquires them, and subsequently kick and bite under his care, it would make him a bad animal keeper. Likewise, if under his care as a statesman, the people of Athens became wilder than he found them, Pericles was not a good politician. This is consistent with the earlier claim that politics is the art that makes for a better soul. In the case of Pericles, I'm not sure that the Athenians proclaiming him corrupt does not indicate instead that they became more virtuous when he was their leader, and that their eventual dissatisfaction with him indicates it. Maybe you'd have to be there to know. At any rate, why politics in particular should be the one art of the soul is unclear to me. Maybe Plato thought that the one who wields state power has no excuse for failing. But if philosophy is to be the art of the soul, then Plato would have another argument for the philosopher king, with the union of state power with the soul's art. In reality, philosophers, academics, churches, media, educators, rich people and their corporate leaders, as well as politicians, can affect the soul for better or for worse, and be asked if they made their people better, and could all deserve some praise or blame. Our societies are larger and more complex than Plato's Athens, and I think it can become a question of a culture that we should preserve or change. As for our crop of contemporaries, I would say that by this standard of the results, all of them of every political stripe are garbage going back at least into the 1960s. My reasons include less violent crime before, when a mass murder was big in the news because it only happened every few years. There was a qualitatively more peaceful criminal in the break-and-enter artist who sought to steal from you when you're not at home, rather than today's home invader who will just deal with you if you are there. Respect used to mean benevolence toward all, rather than reverence for those groups on a list, leading the generation after mine to create Kick a Ginger Day. There also used to be a better general social cohesion and trust, where we even had a milkman. If you were visiting neighbors when he came, when neighbors used to be friends, you leave your empties on the doorstep, your door unlocked, and the money on the kitchen table, along with a note ordering anything else. And when you returned, your change was on the table and your purchases were in the fridge. This was in my childhood only, but it is in the living memory of people alive today. And this is without examining the previous economics of one income earner in most households and the positives of a stronger family. In Plato's theory, this negative trajectory is a predictable result of pandering to people who avoid the effort of becoming virtuous and still demand the same recognition and a culture that serves them. There is slightly more to the dialogue, but I have concluded my theme of power politics versus philosophy. If you enjoyed it, please hit those like and subscribe buttons, check out my other videos, and thanks for watching.